She wandered through the forest, basket in hand, appearing to be nothing more than a woman gathering mushrooms for her family's dinner. The Nazi officers who passed her on the road barely gave her a second glance. A simple woman, perhaps slightly eccentric with her careful examination of fungi, but harmless. This was their fatal mistake. For beneath her unassuming exterior, Dr. Helena Kowalski wasn't collecting ingredients for a meal. She was cultivating one of the most ingenious biological weapons of World War II. Her weapon of choice? The silent patient killers that grew beneath the forest floor. And with them, she would bring a critical Nazi supply line to its knees. Before the war transformed her life, Helena Kowalski was one of Poland's most promising mycologists. The daughter of a university professor and a pharmacist, she had grown up with a deep fascination for the hidden world of fungi. While other children played with toys, Helena collected specimens from the woods surrounding their Krakow home. By 32, she had earned her doctorate and published groundbreaking research on mushroom toxicity that earned recognition throughout European scientific circles. Her laboratory at Warsaw University was her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself for hours cataloging species and studying their chemical properties. On weekends, she taught community classes, sharing her enthusiasm with amateur foragers about which mushrooms were safe to eat and which could kill. The difference between medicine and poison, she would tell her students with a gentle smile, is often just a matter of dose. Helena had married another scientist, Tadeusz, who studied plant genetics. They had built a modest but happy life together, with plans to someday combine their research. They discussed children, expeditions to catalog rare fungi in the Carpathian Mountains, and growing old together surrounded by books and botanical samples. But the war had other plans. The German invasion of Poland in September 1939 shattered the life Helena had built. Within weeks, the Nazis had occupied Warsaw. The university was closed, her laboratory confiscated, and converted into a German military research facility. Jewish colleagues disappeared. Others were sent to labor camps or executed for resistance activities. The true turning point came on a cold November morning when Helena returned from a foraging trip to find her apartment building partially collapsed from a German bombardment. Tadeusz had been inside, working on research notes. His body was recovered 3 days later. That night, as Helena sat in a neighbor's kitchen, numb with grief, the radio quietly transmitted news of Nazi supply convoys moving through Poland, carrying ammunition and food to the Eastern Front. The announcer spoke in hushed tones about the need for resistance, for any action that might slow the German war machine. Helena stared at her hands, the hands of a scientist, not a soldier. She had no gun, no explosives, no military training. But as she thought about the fungi samples in her basket, something crystallized in her mind. The knowledge she had spent a lifetime accumulating suddenly revealed its deadly potential. This was the moment she realized she could not stay silent. Helena's transformation from academic to saboteur did not happen overnight. She first contacted her former laboratory assistant, now working with a local resistance cell. Through him, she met Marek, a railway worker with access to the schedules of German supply trains and truck convoys. "I'm not a fighter," she told him during their first clandestine meeting in the back room of a bakery, "but I know things about mushrooms that could be useful." Marek was skeptical until Helena explained the properties of certain fungi species, how some contained compounds that, when properly processed, could cause severe illness or death, often with symptoms that mimicked common diseases. More importantly, many were tasteless when added to food. The Germans have centralized kitchens that prepare meals for their supply line workers and drivers, Marek said, his interest growing. If we could access those. The plan took shape over the following weeks. Helena would need to cultivate specific species in quantities large enough to be effective. She set up a hidden laboratory in the cellar of an abandoned hunting cabin outside Warsaw, accessible only through a trapdoor concealed beneath rotting floorboards. Here she worked methodically, growing cultures of Amanita phalloides, death caps, and extracting their amatoxins. She developed a concentrated powder that could be added to food without detection. The dose was critical, enough to cause severe illness that would incapacitate the victims for days, but not enough to kill most healthy adults. No one suspected that the quiet botanist who kept to herself was carrying the Allies' future in her pocket. Helena's first mission came in early 1942. A German supply convoy was scheduled to depart from a depot outside Warsaw, carrying ammunition and replacement parts for tanks at the Eastern Front. The night before departure, Helena, dressed as a cleaning woman, entered the depot kitchen with false papers provided by the resistance. While the head cook argued with a German officer about the next day's rations, she sprinkled her powder into a large pot of stew intended for the convoy driver's morning meal. 24 hours later, the news reached her through resistance channels. The convoy had barely made it 30 kilometers before drivers began falling ill with severe stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. The entire shipment was delayed by 3 days, days that gave Soviet forces critical time to reinforce positions near Smolensk. This success emboldened Helena and her growing network. Her next target was more ambitious, a railway junction where German soldiers ate at a centralized canteen. Again disguised as a worker, she contaminated a batch of bread dough. Over 60 German personnel fell ill, and rail operations were disrupted for nearly a week. Word of these mysterious illnesses began to spread among German occupation forces. Medical officers suspected contaminated water or food poisoning from spoiled meat. No one suspected deliberate sabotage by fungi, a weapon invisible to the naked eye. As 1942 progressed, Helena refined her methods. She expanded her garden in the forest, cultivating not just death caps but other toxic species. She developed a system for drying and processing the fungi to maximize potency while minimizing detection risk. The resistance provided her with information on German supply movements, and she struck strategically, sometimes targeting depots that served multiple supply lines. By mid-1943, her operations had expanded. Helena had recruited 3 other botanists and a former pharmacy assistant. She taught them the careful art of fungi cultivation and processing. They established similar hidden laboratories in different regions, creating a network that could disrupt German supply lines across occupied Poland. One of her most daring operations targeted a major supply depot near Lublin in August 1943. This depot served as a central hub for provisions heading to German forces fighting the increasingly difficult Eastern Front campaign. The plan was more complex than previous missions. One of Helena's recruits, Zofia, had secured a position in the depot's administrative office. Through her, they learned that a delegation of high-ranking officers would be visiting for inspection, with a special dinner planned in their honor. "This is an opportunity we cannot miss," Helena told her team during a midnight meeting in the forest. "But the risk is enormous. The dinner would have heightened security, making their usual infiltration methods impossible. Instead, they developed a new approach. They would target the food before it even reached the depot. Helena identified the farm that supplied mushrooms to the depot kitchen. The night before the scheduled harvest, she and 2 resistance fighters slipped onto the property. While her companions kept watch, Helena carefully injected her toxin solution into dozens of perfectly normal-looking mushrooms still growing in their beds. The following evening, these same mushrooms were served sautéed as a side dish at the officers' dinner. By morning, 7 officers, including 2 colonels, were violently ill. The depot's operations descended into chaos as medical staff struggled to treat the stricken officers while maintaining regular supply schedules, but she didn't know the Gestapo was already watching. Helena's success had not gone unnoticed. The pattern of illness among German personnel had finally raised suspicions. The coincidence of strategic supply disruptions and outbreaks of severe gastric illness was too consistent to be chance. The Gestapo assigned an investigator, Major Klaus Richter, to examine these incidents. Richter was methodical and patient, qualities that made him exceptionally dangerous. He began interviewing kitchen staff at affected facilities, comparing staff rosters, and checking work permits. In October 1943, one of Helena's team was caught using forged papers at a checkpoint. Under torture, he revealed fragments of information, not about Helena directly, but enough to point Richter toward the possibility of botanical sabotage. The breakthrough came when Richter consulted a German military botanist who suggested that the symptoms described in medical reports were consistent with certain mushroom toxins. This revelation narrowed the investigation focus considerably. Helena became aware of the danger when one of her resistance contacts failed to appear for a scheduled meeting. Instead, a boy delivered a hastily scrawled note. "They know about the mushrooms. Richter looking for a woman botanist. Destroy everything." That night, Helena burned her notes and cultures in the forest laboratory. She buried her equipment and prepared to flee to a resistant safe house in the countryside. As dawn broke, she set out through the forest on a route she had walked hundreds of times. She had just crossed a small stream when she heard dogs barking in the distance. The Gestapo had picked up her trail faster than she had anticipated. With the sound of pursuit growing closer, Helena made a desperate decision. She reached into her pocket for the small vial she always carried, a concentrated dose of amatoxin she had kept as a last resort. But instead of taking it herself, she uncorked the vial and dripped its contents onto several harmless-looking mushrooms growing alongside the path. Then she continued running, deliberately leaving signs of her passage, broken branches, footprints in soft earth. When the Gestapo dogs reached the spot minutes later, they sniffed the mushrooms Helena had contaminated. The handler, seeing what appeared to be an edible species, carelessly brushed them aside. Unknown to him, the dogs had already licked their paws after contact with the toxin. By evening, the pursuit had been called off as the dogs became too sick to continue. This bought Helena the crucial hours she needed to reach the safe house and eventually escape to the Eastern Territories held by advancing Soviet forces. History would remember what she did next. After reaching Soviet lines, Helena offered her unique expertise to the Allied war effort. Working with Soviet and later British intelligence, she helped develop protocols to protect Allied food supplies from similar sabotage and trained operatives in her techniques for use behind enemy lines. Her most significant legacy, however, came after the war. The knowledge Helena had developed about fungi toxins, their extraction, preservation, and delivery became the foundation for post-war medical research. Compounds isolated from the very mushrooms she had used as weapons were later developed into treatments for certain cancers and immune disorders. In the years after the war, Helena rarely spoke about her resistance activities. She returned to academic life, accepting a position at a university in the United States where few knew of her wartime past. She published groundbreaking papers on mycology and trained a new generation of botanists, never revealing that her intimate knowledge of fungi toxicology came from years spent weaponizing them against Nazi supply lines. The full extent of her impact on the war remains difficult to quantify. Conservative estimates suggest her operations delayed or disrupted at least 37 major supply shipments, affecting thousands of German troops and possibly altering the outcome of several Eastern Front battles by denying German forces timely resupply. Helena Kowalski died in 1987 at the age of 80. Her wartime activities still largely classified. It was only in the early 2000s, when Polish resistance archives were fully opened, that historians began to piece together the story of the botanist who turned fungi into a weapon of war. Today, a small display in Warsaw's World War II museum contains a simple mushroom basket alongside a faded photograph of a serious-looking woman in a laboratory coat. Most visitors pass it without a second glance, unaware they're looking at one of the war's most unusual and effective saboteurs. Her name may fade on paper, but her courage, like the fungi she studied, continues to thrive in the shadows, a testimony to human ingenuity in the darkest of times. While generals commanded armies and politicians directed nations, it was a botanist with a basket who showed that resistance can take the most unexpected forms, and that sometimes the deadliest weapons grow silently beneath our feet, waiting for someone with the knowledge and the courage to wield them.